Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show. I want to talk about a argument that I often see in apologetics being used by Catholic apologists. I've actually used it myself before, but I think this argument has really ran out of gas and probably needs to be retired, or at the very least modified, because there's some truth to it. But I think that educated Protestants and educated Orthodox are going to have some legitimate comebacks to it. And so the apologists will want to be aware of these comebacks and perhaps make provision for that whenever arguing for the Catholic perspective. Before we dive into the question on what that argument is and why it needs modifications, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button and the like button if you don't mind. We're going to talk about this. We're also going to address the question of why it is that the New Testament forbids a person to bind another person's conscience to fasting, as Paul himself notes, but then the Catholic Church binds people's conscience to fast during Ash Wednesday and also Good Friday. How is it that you can have those two things? Is somehow the Catholic practice contradicting what Paul said when he says, let no man, bind you to what days to celebrate, what days to fast, and so on and so forth. So we're going to take a look at that. And then also, I want to ask y'all a theological question, and I want y'all to spot the heresy and name the heresy for me. I'm going to ask the question up front right now, and then go over the answer towards the end of the show. But I'll give it to y'all now so you have a moment to kind of process it through and think of your answers. And of course, feel free to put them in the comment section as soon as you think of it. Okay, so here's what one commenter said. I'm not going to say who the commenter is, but they came up in the comment section, and here's what they said. Catholics don't believe Jesus is God necessarily. He is a man united to the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. So we walk with Muslims. So I guess that person is saying that Catholicism is in agreement with Muslims on the question of the person of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. So again, I'll repeat that for you. I want you to name that heresy because there's definitely a heresy here. Name that heresy for me. He says, Catholics don't believe Jesus is God necessarily. He is a man united to the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. Now, if y'all have done my courses on the ecumenical councils, or you've seen my videos on the Council of Ephesus, hint, hint, you probably know what heresy this is. But go ahead and think that one through and have your answer ready for me by the end of the show. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the first argument that I think that needs some modification. We see this one very, very often. I'm going to show it to you on the screen. And by the way, I don't know who this individual is. Seems like a really nice guy. I'm not trying to pick on him. I don't know him from Adam. I just came across his video, and he's presenting a common argument that I see in apologetic circles made by Catholic apologists. Again, I have made this argument myself before, and I think that it's ran out of gas and at the very least needs some modification up front. So again, not trying to pick on this guy or anything like that, but I'm going to show you his video because he illustrates the argument very well. So you should be able to see your screen right around now, and let's go ahead and dive in.
Does the Catholic Church allow divorce in the case of adultery? No. Our Lord says you cannot divorce your wife unless in the case of adultery. Is the Catholic Church undermining Scripture? Well, the question becomes, how do we interpret that? This is the problem that we have now with all the division in our churches. So many ways to interpret Scripture. The Orthodox Church will say, no, this is a case where divorce is permissible, and the Eastern Orthodox Church will allow it, I believe, up to 3 times. The Catholic Church says, no, we don't allow it. And so we have this verse in Scripture, and it's like, well, who's right? And the Catholic Church says, well, actually, the word used here for adultery correct me if I'm wrong, is porneia. And in other parts of the Bible, when they speak about adultery, they don't use that word. That word's actually used when they're referring to like a concubine or a relationship that wasn't actually a valid marriage in the first place. Someone has to have the authority to interpret. It's not me and it's not you. It's the church. It's the same church that gave you the Bible. If you trust the Bible that they gave you, surely you trust them to interpret it. And now we have over 40,000 Christian churches.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. And you've probably heard this argument many times. And basically what the person is arguing is that, the church has given us the Bible, and so the church is therefore the authentic interpreter, which is, what the Second Vatican Council, for instance, says in Dei Verbum. And so it's the church that is the authentic interpreter. And so if it's given us the Bible, it should be able to give us the correct interpretation. Without the magisterium, we're just going to, argue on the correct meaning of this or that. And the example he gives is the question of adultery. Jesus says, that he doesn't allow for adultery except in the case of, it doesn't allow for divorce, except in the case of adultery. So the big question is on divorce and remarriage, and what does Jesus mean when he says except in adultery? He rightly points out the Greek term there doesn't necessarily mean adultery. It could mean incest. It could mean some kind of invalid marriage. And so others are going to dispute that and just say that it means sexual immorality, and therefore adultery would be a form of that. And so you'll have Eastern Orthodox who will allow for divorce and remarriage based on that verse. And so you'll have people who are disputing the words of Jesus, or we've seen Jesus, saying that he doesn't know the day or the hour. And some people have disputed that in history and come up with all sorts of different Christological explanations and perspectives because of it. And so the argument here again is that ultimately you need a magisterium, otherwise you end up with, he says, 40,000 different Christian churches that often repeated claim that there's 40,000 different denominations, all because of sola scriptura and a lack of the magisterium and so on and so forth. So you've heard this before very often. Again, you've probably heard this from me a few years ago. There's some truth to it. Obviously, if you have a magisterium, that's going to be able to offer solutions that individual opinions can't. So if you have a magisterium that is, divinely commissioned to give some kind of settling of a theological dispute, that, and people are following the magisterium, then that's going to bring a lot more harmony than every man for themselves, right? Every person trying to figure it out for themselves. So there's some truth to that, right? I don't want to take away from that. But I think when it's presented that way, it's ran out of gas because you're more educated Protestants and Eastern Orthodox have picked up on some of the problems here. Not only them, but some Catholics have picked up on the problem. And that's one of the reasons why you're currently seeing a lot of disputes taking place in the Catholic Church itself. So a lot of people all around are picking up on the problem. Well, what is that problem? There's actually several of them. Number one, I'll point out that at this time, it's easier for the average individual to consult the sources of tradition, the Bible, the church fathers, the liturgy, and so on. It's easier for an individual to consult those theological sources and places to find an answer to a theological question than it is to get the magisterium to settle a theological dispute. Did you hear what I said? It's easier for the individual to find the answer themselves through the sources of tradition themselves than it is to get the magisterium to answer a theological dispute these days. It's no secret, or at least you should know, the magisterium tends to drag its feet. It's always done this. And there might be a theological dispute going on for decades or even centuries before the magisterium settles the question, which is not very helpful to all the people who needed the answer but died in the meantime waiting on the answer. Might be helpful to the people who receive the answer, but not to the people in the meantime, right? Not only that, not only just speaking of the track record of it having this delayed effect, but again, even today, the magisterium drags its feet on all sorts of theological issues that it could settle. It has the potential, it has the ability to settle, but it's chosen not to. There are many examples. I'll give you just a couple. Number one, can the Pope teach heresy in his authentic magisterium whenever he teaches non-definitively? Obviously, the church teaches that when he teaches infallibly, without error. But when he teaches non-infallibly, yet in his authoritative magisterium, can he teach heresy then? You know why that's an important question? Because it's being debated by a massive amount of Catholics right now. Numerous Catholics, from cardinals on down, are saying that Pope Francis teaches heresy, or that Benedict taught heresy, or that John Paul II taught heresy, or that Pope X, Y, and Z taught heresy. While numerous other Catholics say, no, no Pope has taught heresy, and no Pope can teach heresy in their authentic magisterium. So you'll have these huge, huge debates. And these are going to have massive consequences. Why? Because some are going to argue, well, if this Pope teaches heresy, that proves that they're not the Pope. Or they'll say, well, they're still the Pope. But the further problem is, well, if you have to then determine if the Pope is teaching heresy or not, then that puts you back into the driver's seat. That puts you back into the driver's seat in order to find an answer to a theological question. And the whole point of that argument that we just heard from the Catholic apologists was to avoid putting you in the driver's seat. Because if you're in the driver's seat, 40,000 denominations, right? Okay. But if it's back to you determining if the Pope is teaching heresy or not, then you're back to the driver's seat. And now it's every man for themselves again. And this is why you have numerous Catholics fighting against each other right now online because of this issue. Now, could the magisterium settle this dispute? Yeah, it could. It could easily settle the dispute. It could easily come back and say the popes cannot teach heresy in their authentic magisterium, even when they teach non-definitively and give an explanation for it. Or it could come back and say, yes, the popes could teach heresy. But then we're left with the massive problem of, okay, then who determines when the Pope is teaching heresy? The individual? Well, we're back to the problem with Protestantism, because the individual at that point is the ultimate interpreter, not the magisterium. Okay, so that's a massive problem, a massive debate that is raging right now in the Catholic Church, and the magisterium doesn't answer the question, doesn't settle it. In fact, a professor colleague of mine asked the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith to settle that question. And the Dicastery wrote back and said, basically, it's not within the scope of this present Dicastery to answer the question. Even though the Dicastery is perfectly competent to do so, even though it's its job to do so, even though there's a really big need to do so, so it's like this is a major part of your job description kind of thing, DDF says they're not going to answer the question, conveniently. Well, not very helpful for everybody who is trying to work through this question and all of the very massive implications it has to day-to-day Catholic life. So these are not, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin kind of question. These are very important disputes that have real life consequences that can take some people out of communion with the Catholic Church. And so there's a need to settle it, and yet the magisterium has chosen not to. Not the first time we've seen this from the magisterium. Again, it's dragged its feet numerous times throughout church history. So there's a massive problem there, and I think an educated non-Catholic is going to point that out. Now, if the magisterium can't teach heresy, right? Let's say the authentic magisterium cannot contain heresy in it. All right. Well, wouldn't there then be a need to then rebuke Cardinal Mueller, Cardinal Sarah, Bishop Schneider, Bishop Strickland, former Archbishop Vigano? Wouldn't there be a need to rebuke them? Because every one of those figures and many more have accused the papal magisterium of teaching heresy in this current pontificate. Every single one of them says Pope Francis teaches heresy in his magisterium. Every one of them, and more. And that has massive consequences on the followers of those cardinals and bishops. And the people who follow them are then led into a certain position with very serious consequences. So if those cardinals are wrong and are in error, then they need to be corrected. The magisterium, however, has no interest in currently correcting them, as we see. So I think the average non-Catholic is just going to come back and say, okay, well, your magisterium can settle theological disputes, but it chooses not to, and there's really serious needs to do so. And so practically it's worthless. If it can offer a solution, but it doesn't, then it's useless to me. If you have someone breaking into your house and there's a guy next to you in the house, and this is maybe one of your friends, and y'all see that there's somebody breaking into the house. You might not have a gun, but your friend does, right? Okay. Well, it'd be really nice if your friend uses that gun to stop that person when they break in, because that person is going to come and kill y'all. Okay. Now, your friend could use that gun and could stop the person, and yet chooses not to. At that point, the gun is useless. He has the gun, but it's useless. That's how we understand the magisterium currently. It has the ability to settle the question, but it chooses not to. Therefore, a non-Catholic is just going to come back and say, well, it sounds really nice theoretically, but in practice, it's useless because it's not settling theological disputes currently. So this is a response that I think Catholic apologists need to be prepared to answer. There's another point that needs to be considered, because there's not just this one. Another one. The answers given by the magisterium are not always intellectually satisfactory to the questioner. Now, that's different than whether or not a person is bound to the answer. From the Catholic perspective, the person is bound to the answer of the magisterium, whether they understand it or not, whether they're intellectually satisfied with the answer or not. See Donum Veritatis. Be that as it may, the average thinking man is going to still ask, hey, how does this make sense? If the answer is not theologically satisfactory, they're always in the back of their mind going to wonder, but how does this work? And they're going to have that doubt. Let me give you an example. The case of the death penalty. So let me show you something real quick on my screen. Numerous passages in the Old Testament, and some even in the New Testament, speak of the death penalty. But here's one. And this is where it's commanded in the Old Testament. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Leviticus 24:17. So God in the Old Testament commands the death penalty. Now, if you look at the revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Pope Francis, CCC 2267, it says this: recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding of the common good. Today, however, there's an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it's an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. And so I've done a couple videos attempting to harmonize the church's perspective here. You're welcome to go and watch the death penalty videos. Not going to reproduce that here, but the average person is going to say, wait, if God allowed, or actually commanded, not just allowed, but commanded the death penalty in the Old Testament, but now it is inadmissible because it violates human dignity, did God then violate the dignity of the human person? Did he just not know the dignity of the human person? Did he not have that awareness? Of course, people are going to say, no, obviously God had the awareness. Okay, so then God then commanded for the violation of the dignity of the human person. And if he did that in the Old Testament, why can't he do that in the New Covenant? So a lot of people are just going to push back, and they're going to say, I don't know how these two things cohere. Now, you're perfectly welcome to offer a harmonization. Again, I've done so here on this channel. The point, however, is the average person, when they look at this, they're not going to be intellectually satisfied with just the answer we just saw there in the catechism. They're going to have further questions, right? They're going to have further questions. Does the church answer those further questions? No, it does not. So sometimes the church offers positions, but it doesn't always offer an explanation for them. Now, you're still bound to adhere to what the church teaches, whether you agree with or understand the explanation according to Dona Veritatis. But again, the average person is still going to be intellectually unsatisfied, and they're going to still wonder, how do these two things cohere? And so it's not enough to just simply say, here's the answer. The magisterium needs to give satisfactory explanations for why this is the answer. Otherwise, the average person is going to find it too difficult to really assent to this. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that's what the average person is going to experience. And so if the church cares about them, they will accompany them. They will bring them alongside, and they will try to help them understand. And it can't just be the role of apologists and theologians to do that, because at the end of the day, I can offer a solution to harmonize them, but you might say, oh, I don't agree. Oh, that's Pope-splaining. All right, so at that point, you just completely dismiss it. So what do we do now? Well, it would be helpful if the magisterium offered that harmonization, because that carries more weight than just someone like me offering an explanation. Now, number 3. We heard the example of divorce and remarriage from this individual. Well, is this the best example you really want to offer people as a Catholic? Do you really want to offer this example? You really want to say, well, okay, look at divorce and remarriage. And, if you don't have the magisterium, you can come up with all kinds of answers, and there's going to be huge, amounts of division. And so you're going to have 40,000 different denominations, because they're trying to settle the question of what does Jesus mean by, his position on divorce and remarriage and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Is this the best example? No, probably not. Because while it's true that in theory and on paper, the church doesn't allow for divorce and remarriage whenever there isn't a decree of nullity or declaration of nullity, when there isn't an annulment. While that's true in theory and on paper, we all know that in practice, annulments are given out in the vast majority of cases. In fact, 94% or more, these are according to older estimates, they would have increased since Pope Francis's reforms of the annulment process. Over 94% of annulment requests are granted. So at that point, a person is going to come back and say, well, all right, on paper and in theory, you hold to a view that there is no divorce and remarriage. But in practice and in reality, your practice practically allows for it. So on the one hand, you want to say something, on the other, on the other hand, you practice another. Now, somebody might come back and say, no, actually, in the majority of those cases, the annulments are legitimate because of X, Y, and Z. I understand some people are going to argue that. Believe me, I get it. But you could see why a lot of people would feel like, it seems to me like the practice doesn't necessarily line up with the doctrine. We've seen numerous cases where this happens, where the discipline of the church does not line up with the doctrine of the church. Numerous examples of this. And a lot of people have pointed out to this, and there's been a lot of disputes in the Catholic Church because the discipline doesn't line up with the doctrine. People who are publicly unrepentant and public scandal, um, being able to receive communion publicly. We know that's against the doctrine, and yet it's done constantly, right? So there's one discipline that's completely contrary to the doctrine, or at least practice, I should say. I wouldn't necessarily call it a discipline, but you get what I'm saying. So some people are going to say, what's the point of even having the doctrine if you don't back it up in your actions, if you don't actually back it up in the discipline? And you might come back and say, well, it's still important that we have things theoretically right, and that helps orient us to get our discipline in shape. Sure, yeah, but we still need to get that discipline in shape, right? Still need to get that back in line. And if it's not in line, some people are going to say, well, what good is the doctrine if you're not going to actually follow the doctrine yourself? Okay, so these are some common responses that I think your more educated non-Catholics are going to come back whenever you present them that argument that, hey, you need the magisterium because it settles theological questions, and if you don't have it, you'll end up in 40,000 denominations. They're going to be unsatisfied. And they're also going to point out to the massive amount of divisions in the Catholic Church. And you can point out, well, yeah, those divisions are there because people aren't following the magisterium. In some cases, that's true. In other cases, it's because the magisterium has not clarified a matter that it should have clarified and has not yet done so. So those are things that people need to be aware of. And so my suggestion is, if you're going to make this argument about, the magisterium has the ability to settle theological disputes, and so we won't fragment into a million different churches. If you're going to use that, at least go ahead and account for, in your initial presentation, this pushback, and offer some solutions here, because I think the average person, when they listen to this stuff at this point in Catholic apologetics, they're probably not very satisfied if they know anything about the situation in the Catholic Church today. And what we're doing at that point is we're setting them up for failure, because if you're giving them bad arguments up front, you're setting them up for failure when they come back and say, wait, this doesn't work. You told me X, Y, and Z, but now I'm seeing it's actually this way. And I know a very well-known Catholic apologist. I'm not going to name who he is, but he's been struggling with going back to Protestantism for a long time. And I remember him telling me at one point that every one of the theological reasons and apologetic reasons for why he converted to Catholicism, he said, turns out to be false. Every one of those arguments turned out to be false. All the arguments that he heard and embraced for the papacy and for the magisterium, he told me every one of them are false. And yeah, I do agree that pretty much every one of the arguments that he had embraced in order to receive Catholicism, yeah, those arguments were wrong. I agree with him. That doesn't mean his decision was wrong, but it does mean the arguments were wrong. And he really struggles with that issue. And he's kind of like, why did I even convert kind of thing? Because I converted for the wrong reasons, or all of the reasons why I converted turns out to be false. And so now his conversion in his mind is in doubt. So at that point, if you're using these bad arguments, people are going to figure this out. And, at some point you're really setting them up for failure if you give them these really half-baked arguments that don't account for pushback. So be aware, this could have very serious consequences in impacting people, because they could come back later and say, hey, you told me the X, Y, and Z, but it turns out that it wasn't that simple. And now they're questioning their conversion to Catholicism or discernment of Catholicism or whatever. Keep that in mind. Now, I want to briefly shift gears. I want to take a look at a question that was sent to me by a questioner, a commenter. Very thoughtful question, one that I've asked myself even before converting to the Catholic Church. I think it's worthy of examining. So this person asks a really good question. Here's the question. The person says, and by the way, I think they're commenting on a post that I did about Lent and the 40 days of fasting and all that. Okay, so this person says, I must confess, Michael, that the Pope making the disobedience of this mortal sin is one of the biggest stumbling blocks on coming into the Catholic Church. So this person is saying that, you know, for the magisterium to say, hey, you're in mortal sin if you don't fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and you don't abstain from meat on Fridays during Lent, this person is saying that's a stumbling block for him. And here's why. He says, it truly makes me question the legitimacy of the papacy when this command is opposite to what Paul says in Romans 14:5-6. So Paul says, one person regards one day above another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord. He gives thanks to God, and he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat and gives thanks to God. And by the way, there's another passage from Paul where he says, let not another man judge you about these kinds of matters, on whether you can eat or abstain and what days to celebrate. And let not a man judge you on those things. All right, so there's actually a stronger scripture passage that this individual could point to. Be that as it may. He says, how can the papacy be of God when our very salvation hangs in the balance over what Paul says should be an individual choice? He says, Catholic apologists have explained the three requirements for what a mortal sin is, but beyond that, I've not come across any Catholic online that deals with this matter. Any insight that you have are greatly appreciated. A very thoughtful question, one that I asked myself when I was a Protestant. I appreciate it. I think it's a very legitimate question. So here is the response. Well, here's the response I initially heard, and I don't think is satisfactory. The response I initially heard when I was a Protestant was that, well, Paul is talking about Old Testament feasts and Old Testament dietary restrictions. He's not talking about, ones in the New Covenant. Hardly satisfactory, just because the thrust of Paul is not to speak about Old versus New Covenant. The thrust of Paul was, don't let another man judge you on these things, right? That was the thrust. Okay, so yeah, maybe not the best answer. All right, so what's perhaps a better one? Well, if you look at the New Testament, let me pull up my screen. Take a look at Matthew 16:18-19, or Matthew 18:18. It says, I tell you, you are Peter, on this rock I'll build my church, and the power of death shall not prevail against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. Okay, so very famous passage that we often see brought up in ecclesiological disputes. And it points to Peter, and then from the Catholic perspective, Peter's successors, the Pope, having the ability to bind and loose. Bind and loose can be a doctrinal matter. It could also be something that's disciplinary. So the church can require you to adhere to a certain discipline and then not require you to adhere to it. It could change it. It could bind it loose. It could lock. It can unlock, if you will. It can lock you into this discipline. It can unlock you from that discipline. That's the notion of binding and loosing. And here Jesus is giving Peter, and from the Catholic perspective, and his successors, the popes, the ability to bind and loose in matters of discipline. Okay, so when you look at the New Testament, you'll see in Acts chapter 15, 29, the apostles, after their council in Jerusalem, wrote to the Christians outside Jerusalem saying, you are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, and from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You do well to avoid these things. Notice, sexual immorality is something that can never change, that you can't bind and loose on that. However, the question of abstaining from food sacrificed to idols and with blood in it, meat with blood in it, that has changed in Catholic history. For example, at the Council of Florence, the Ecumenical Council of Florence, the church decided to loose people from that discipline. So the church recognizes this is a discipline from the apostles, but the church loosed people from that apostolic discipline. Not the first time the church has done this. Here's what Florence says. The council, firmly believes, professes, and teaches that every creature of God is good and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving, because according to the word of the Lord, not what goes into the mouth defiles a person, and because the difference in the Mosaic law between clean and unclean foods belong to ceremonial practices, which have passed away and lost their efficacy with the coming of the gospel, it also declares that the apostolic prohibition to abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what is strangled was suited to the time when a single church was rising from Jews and Gentiles who previously lived with different ceremonies and customs. This was so that the Gentiles should have some observances in common with the Jews. An occasion should be offered of coming together in one worship and faith of God, and a cause of dissension might be removed, since by the ancient custom blood and strangled things seemed abominable to Jews, and Gentiles could be thought to be returning to idolatry if they ate sacrificial food. In places, however, where the Christian religion had been promulgated to such an extent that no Jew is to be met with, and all have joined the church, uniformly practicing the same rites and ceremonies of the gospel, and believing that to the clean all things are clean, since the cause of that apostolic prohibition had ceased, so its effect had ceased. It condemns then no kind of food and of food that human society accepts, and nobody at all, neither man nor woman, should make a distinction between animals, no matter how they died, although for the health of the body, for the practice of virtue, and for the sake of regular and ecclesiastical discipline, many things that are not prescribed can and should be omitted. As the apostle says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. So, long story short, what Florence is saying is this. It's saying for various reasons, the apostles had that discipline of eating no meat with blood in it. But for various reasons today, we're going to loose that discipline so people can eat meat with blood in it. Not the only time the church has done that. Communion in under one kind is something that came about around the time of the Council of Florence, and Florence recognizes that the apostolic practice was to administer communion on the hand in both kinds. But what do you do when the church is now saying, no, you can only receive under one kind? We're now going against the apostles. What do we say to that? Well, the church basically said, yeah, this is a practice that's different than the apostles, but the church has the ability to bind it loose. So it all hinges on the claim of whether or not in Matthew 16:18 through 19 and Matthew 18:18, the church today, because of those passages, has the ability to bind the loose and to loose people from certain apostolic practices and disciplines. It all hinges on that. Now, if you are Catholic, then you have to answer, yes, the church has that authority. If you're not Catholic, then you're going to have theological disputes on the meaning of Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. But if you're Catholic, you're going to say, yes, the church has that authority, and there it is. So from the Catholic perspective, that would be the answer. Now, going to the last bit here, where the person asked, or I asked y'all at the beginning of this video, name this heresy. Okay, now we're going to go over it. And for those of y'all just now tuning in who didn't hear the beginning, let me repeat what one commenter said, and I want you to tell me what the heresy is, because there's definitely a heresy here. A commenter on my channel said, Catholics don't believe Jesus is God necessarily. He is a man united to the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. So we walk with Muslims. All right, so name that heresy, okay? And it might not be the one that you initially think of. I suspect there's going to be some people thinking this is Arianism. It's more refined than that. Take a wild guess. Name that heresy. A person who says Catholics don't believe Jesus is God necessarily. He's a man united to the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. What does that sound like to y'all? I saw a few people in the chat earlier when I asked it initially at the beginning of the video. Few people got it. I want to see, though, some more answers there in the comment section. One person says Protestantism. No. Although there are some Protestants who do hold to this heresy. For example, William Lane Craig, I believe. But Roundtable got it. Repair of the Breach got it. Matthew, close, but no cigar. Repair says Nestorianism. Roundtable says Nestorianism. Correct, sir. You are correct. Nestorianism. Why? Okay, well, he says that Jesus is a man. Okay, so at that point, you have a human nature. Okay, if you're a man, you got a human nature. All right. So he says Jesus is a man, human nature, united to the second person of the Trinity, the Logos. And he's saying this to say that Jesus is not necessarily God. Now, Orthodox Trinitarianism, the correct understanding of Christology, would say that the second person of the Trinity united to a human, a human nature, if you will. But the human nature, of course, did not pre-exist. There was never a time, when the human nature existed, but it wasn't united. But that's not what he's saying, because he's saying that Jesus is not necessarily God. So what he's doing at that point is he's making a radical difference between the human Jesus and the divine Logos that he says are united. Well, what is that? When you have a human Jesus and a divine Jesus that are united, but they're not united in such a way that you could speak of Jesus as God, what do you have? You have classic Nestorianism. That is literally the Nestorian debate. Like, you could not describe the Nestorian heresy any better than the way this guy did it. The reason why you could say Jesus is God is because you have one person, two natures, and those two natures are united in the one person, and that is a divine person. And so you have to necessarily say that Jesus is God, but he says, no, you can't say he's necessarily God, because he's thinking that Jesus is two separate beings or two separate persons. They might have some kind of unity, but they're still radically divided to where you won't necessarily call one nature divine, or you won't necessarily call Jesus divine because of this separation. And so this is, classic Nestorianism, and is certainly not the Catholic perspective or the Eastern Orthodox perspective. And frankly, it's not also the Oriental Orthodox perspective either. And so, it's interesting to see how some of these heresies repeat themselves. In fact, Shalom is mentioning that. Is it just me, or is it all the heresies keep repeating themselves? Yeah, they do keep repeating themselves, because it's kind of easy to fall into some of these heresies if you don't have a strong foundation in theology and church history. It's going to be easy to fall into some of this stuff and make some of the same mistakes. Which is why you need to know theology, you need to know church history, you need to know these things so that you don't make the same mistakes. It's kind of like, what's that phrase? It's something along the lines of, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, or something like that. Same thing here. Those who don't know church history and theology are doomed to repeat the same heresies that you find in church history. So, it's important to know these things. Of course, if you want to know more about them, you need to check out my course on the 7 ecumenical councils, where I go over these heresies and others that are found in the first millennium. You can go to ctresearch.org and just click on the 7 ecumenical councils course and check it out, because I think that you'll find a lot of good resources there if you want to understand the church's perspective on Christological matters better. Here's the course again, ctresearch.org. Just scroll down here to the 7 ecumenical councils, and I go over again Nicaea 1 all the way to Nicaea 2, and so I cover a lot of the history, the canons, and the teachings and the controversies behind them. So certainly check out that course if that's interesting to you. Anyways, I hope this has been beneficial to you. If it has, make sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button and drop a comment. Let me hear from you. I want to get some feedback. So if you find these videos to be productive, let me know and I'll do some more of them. All right, that's going to do it for today, y'all. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. God bless. Hey, have you been benefiting from this channel but you're not supporting it?
You're definitely guilty.
Get over to patreon.com/reason and theology and support this channel if you've been benefiting from the content.
Did I say get it done now?
And I mean right now.
And if you can't support the show financially, you should at least be subscribed, right? Am I right or am I right?
Yeah, I think he's right.
I'm right. So go and hit the subscribe button right now. Are you seeking clarity in the midst of confusion about Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism? In my book, Answering Orthodoxy, I offer a biblical and historical response to the most common objections that Eastern Orthodox offer against the Catholic Church. This book is for anyone searching for the truth, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, or simply trying to make sense of the differences between Catholics and Orthodox. Order your copy today and discover the rational, biblical, and historical basis for the Catholic Church. Visit Amazon to order your copy today. Are you ready to deepen your faith and sharpen your understanding of theology? Welcome to the Center for Theological Research, your gateway to transformative learning. At CTR, you will find in-depth courses designed to equip you with the tools to grow in your understanding of the faith. Explore courses like the 7 Ecumenical Councils and uncover the foundational truths that shape Christianity. Master the ability to determine the level of a doctrine in the Theological Notes course. And in the Logical Fallacies and Apologetics course, you'll learn to spot the logical errors often encountered in non-Catholic apologetics content. Also, check out the ebooks that are available to you for free. Start your journey today. Visit ctresearch.org and take the next step in your faith formation.